Everyone, and welcome to today's live webcast on prime contracting. I'm Jason Wetzel with Gabriel Enterprises, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm also joined by a team of facilitators who will be providing presentation and technical support, as well as our featured subject matter expert, Shane McCall. Let's talk about the interactive features you can expect during the live webcast. So throughout the course, there will be opportunities for you to interact with the class and our presenters through live polling and asking questions. To receive full credit and your certificate of completion, please be sure to participate in those polling activities. And your certificate of completion will be available in your virtual learning environment profile upon completion of a live webcast session. If you have any questions as we're going through the content, you can just click the Q&A button at any time to ask those questions. And there's also a closed caption feature that you can display on your screen there at the bottom. Following today's session, you will be redirected to a page with a link to the post-course survey. We tell you that now so you can be thinking about the type of feedback you'll provide to help us continually improve this training and your entire virtual learning experience. In addition to the live webcast, the virtual learning environment has multiple rooms you can visit. We'll refer to some of those rooms during today's session. You can check any of those out just by clicking the navigation bar at the bottom of your screen in the virtual learning environment. Also, today's session will be recorded and placed on the completed tab in the live webinar's main theater within just a few hours of the live session ending. And finally, for technical assistance, if you're experiencing technical difficulty during the webcast, just use that Q&A box to explain what's happening, and someone on our support team will provide you with one-on-one assistance. And if you happen to need assistance outside of the course, you can visit the help desk booth in the virtual learning environment. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch our first live poll of the day here. And with this poll, we're just trying to get a sense of your experience serving as a prime contractor. And we do say ignore subcontracts to freelancers or 1099s, just trying to get a sense of your corporation to corporation or company to company subcontracting. We will talk a little bit later about how for compliance purposes, you don't want to ignore those subcontracts to freelancers and 1099s. So-called 1099s. But for now, just looking at company to company prime and subcontract. So go ahead and submit your responses to that poll, and we'll come back on and talk about the results in just a moment. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and looks like we didn't get any response to that poll, so we'll make sure that we hit that next poll here before we close out. We will have one other opportunity for live poll responses a little later on. If you're not seeing those live polls, just let us know in the Q&A. All right, so there will be some legal subject matter that we'll cover today, and our subject matter expert, Shane McCall, who you'll meet in a moment, is a practicing attorney. So we just want to be clear about the nature of the information you'll be receiving today so we can be as helpful as possible without misleading you in any way. So I'll just give you a brief moment to read that disclaimer. All right, so this is our course roadmap. Allows you to see the different courses that are available to you all the way from the beginning of the program to the end of the program. I'm not going to dive too far into this today. We spend a little bit of time in this in just about every session that we have. So you can check out the recordings for those sessions or come to another live session, talk about why we're doing this and how we're doing it. I really think that's important to share as you're spending this hour with us today. But we have a lot of content to cover today, so I'm going to just kind of zip right past this. I will say the schedule for each of these courses is in that live webinars room. You can open that. Our schedule is currently posted through March of 2022, but we'll be offering courses throughout the year. And many of these are offered several times throughout the year. Right, so there are 4 courses that are targeted to firms in years 8 to 9 of the 8A program, so a little bit later in the program. Today's prime contracting course is one of those. In terms of learning objectives, and learning outcomes. Today, we'll focus on the skills, processes, and infrastructure needed to find and manage multiple subcontractors on a large federal contract. And as a small business, this knowledge can be absolutely critical because you likely don't have all the skills and the capacity necessary to go after the kinds of projects that will really help you grow your business. And prime contracting or issuing subcontracts is certainly a way that you can do that. And then also, because this is a year 8 to 9 course focused a little bit on firms a little bit later in the program, you might encounter some information that you've never heard before or something that's confusing. That's what the Q&A is for. We're coming in assuming that you have quite a bit of experience working with the federal government, but if that's not the case, if you don't understand something, don't understand an acronym or a concept, please ask questions as we go. All right, a quick look at the topics. So first we'll look at a roadmap to prime contracting. Then we'll talk about how you can do effective teaming as a prime contractor. And then we'll get into the processes, procedures, and leading practices involved in managing subcontractors. And then we'll consider how your portfolio of teaming partners can help you position to exit the 8A program. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Shane to introduce himself and talk to you about the roadmap to prime contracting.
Yes, thank you so much, Jason. My name is Shane McCall. As Jason mentioned, I'm an equity partner at Coprince McCall Potroff. We're based outside of Kansas City, and we're a boutique law firm that works with federal contractors all over the country and focus on small business with also some large business contractors thrown into the mix. So we do a lot of work with teaming agreements and prime contracts and subcontracts and the rules contained therein. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So first things first, there's kind of a lot of information, as Jason mentioned, in this topic. Some of these slides are pretty dense, so I'll be kind of hitting the highlights of some of those. And of course, you'll have those materials that you can refer back to for some of these key points, and we'll kind of figure out, you can figure out which things are most important to you as a company, but this will give you kind of the framework, the terminology, and some of those key considerations to make as you're working on teaming agreements and subcontracts, either as the prime contractor or as a subcontractor. And these are some things we're sort of assuming about the listener out there and the attendees. You've probably been a subcontractor to multiple prime contractors, and worked on those to build up your past performance. And just to get familiar with contracting issues and develop your skills. Maybe you've worked on a few prime contracts, but not that many. And a lot of those have maybe been 8A set-aside contracts or even sole source contracts for that matter. Maybe you've had less experience managing a contracting team with multiple subcontractors, multiple subcontracts for that matter as well. And you had some small business partners, some large other than small teaming partners, and you got to kind of keep all the rules straight. Have separate agreements for all of those relationships and kind of juggle all that. And maybe you're looking to juggle all that on multiple contracts and proposals at the same time. So it's good to have the set of core concepts to apply to all of these subcontracts and teams that you may be working with. Your subcontractors may be super experienced if they're large businesses. They may be less experienced if they're small businesses. So you may have to bring different ideas to the table based on which subcontractors you're working with, or if you're working as a subcontractor yourself. So let's go through some of the vocabulary, what you need to know when you're talking about prime contracting and subcontracting. Of course, prime contractor, we like to say the buck stops here. If you're the prime contractor, you're 100% responsible for meeting the performance terms and conditions that the government prime contract sets forth. So if the government has an issue with performance or even administrative matters, invoicing, anything like that, they're going to come to the representative of the prime contractor, who then has to dole out that information and keep all the subcontractors abreast of what's going on with the various parts of performance and communications with the government. And you may have subcontracts with companies, with entities themselves, which is fairly common, or if it's an individual that's not an employee of your company and you're the prime contractor, may issue them a 1099, so they're not an employee on a W-2, that is still a subcontractor. And so that person or that entity is performing part of the services, some of the services for the work that's under the prime contract, or they're providing some portion of these supplies, or maybe the supply itself for the government contract. So you got prime contractor. I think people understand the basics of that term, but when you kind of get down to some of the details, there are a few nuances here and there. You got to be, just have to remind yourself of it as you're either gearing up to team with someone or preparing a proposal or working on a subcontract. Prime contractor has to be in charge of that, especially 8A contractor. It's true for all prime contractors, but it's even more so for an 8A prime contractor. You can't delegate certain portions of a contract, so you can't overly allow subcontractors to do too much. So then we have a teaming agreement. Teaming agreement is the standard term, standard concept that's found in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and commonly used by federal contractors. It is how the proposed prime contractor and the proposed subcontractor agree to divide up the work and figure out how they are collectively going to go after a specific proposal on a solicitation. So you're going to have that teaming agreement in place before you submit your proposal, before you ideally before you start marketing and doing the business development stage with the agency. You're going to outline all these, both the kind of the big picture terms and the specifics of what work the subcontractor is going to do for that particular proposal, and then a little bit, some details on how it's going to work if you actually win the contract. Work share is going to be discussed as part of that conversation. It's up to the parties a little bit to decide, how detailed you get on work share. It depends on the type of contract. A lot of these depend on if it's is it a single award? The scope of the contract. Is it an IDIQ multiple award where you don't know the scope? That's going to change how you talk about work share in your agreement. But you have to have that conversation. In your teaming agreement, you're going to want to mention, is it going to be decided later? Is it a percentage? Is there specific dollar amount goals in there? That's what the parties can negotiate. A subcontract can be included as an attachment. That's, that is not too common in my experience, but you can include it there, especially if you've got it, if your parties are ready to do it and they're pretty sure they're going to get the award. That's a really good way to set out some of those details. The other thing that's going to be in your teaming agreement is whether you're going to have exclusivity, working with other firms, non-disclosure of intellectual property and other trade secrets. And again, you can put out some of the details for the subcontract, either as a separate attachment or sometimes within that teaming agreement itself. You say, okay, this is what we've already agreed on. Let's set forth some of the key provisions for our subcontract. So those are some of the key kind of terminology you need. Other terms that are sort of related to these concepts of prime contract and subcontract and teaming agreement, you've got a mentor-protege agreement or mentor-protege arrangement. That's talking more about the assistance that a mentor will provide to a protege in various methods. Some of those can include serving as a prime contractor, having a prime sub team, but it would be a separate agreement from a teaming agreement. A joint venture, again, is a separate arrangement from a prime sub teaming arrangement. Joint venture is going to be two companies collectively acting as the prime contractor on a government contract. In some cases, your mentor-protege agreement will serve as a exclusion or exception to affiliation in those purposes. But the key here for our purposes, joint venture is you'd have a separate written agreement. It's a different approach than a prime sub team where you have one party that's totally in charge, the prime contractor. In a joint venture, there's sort of collective responsibility for those things. Affiliation, just real quickly, is the idea that if you become affiliated with another company, you combine the receipts of those two companies and can render a small business no longer small. In some cases, because it is relying too heavily on a non-small business, and that non-small business can be a subcontractor. So we'll talk about some of these things. You have to be very careful with what you're allowing a subcontractor to do in these agreements. And of course, if you're not a small business, you can have issues with your 8A status. Okay, so why should you issue subcontracts? There's a number of advantages listed on this slide. I think some of the key ones are, you kind of got to think about it for your proposal benefits and your performance benefits. For a proposal, you want to team with another company for things like past performance. Definitely a way to bolster and enhance your proposal and get a better rating and evaluation, get a better chance at winning that contract. Also, the same thing can be with key personnel. Of course, you got to look at the specifics of your solicitation and the evaluation criteria as to whether you're allowed to do that through subcontractors, but in a lot of cases you are. And so that can really help your overall team and get a better evaluation. As far as performance, though, it's also very important to have those skills that are needed to perform the contract, or those capabilities. One company for larger and more complex contracts is not going to be able to do all aspects of the contract in some cases, especially if they're a small business or an 8A company. You can have subject matter expertise. You can have kind of the brand or the marketing power of another business that's a subcontractor. But there's kind of these other marketing aspects of it, gaining access to relationships, meaning your subcontractor may know and be familiar with certain contracting officials and be better able to market the team to them, or certain agencies. They kind of know the ins and outs of how those agencies work and how to market the team to those agencies, what they're looking for. That can be very helpful. And of course, the business through subcontracting or acting as a prime is going to learn these various skills, contracting, technical skills, all those sorts of things. And it's sort of a tryout period. You can learn how a company performs under pressure while actually performing, and build up those relationships as a subcontractor with your subcontractor. Build up the relationships with the agency in many cases, and that can be very helpful for subcontracts. So that's the last slide. There's many advantages to subcontracting, things like marketing, proposal evaluation, and performance. In some cases that you got to think about kind of your whole, which approach is better, which approach works better for a certain solicitation. In some cases, you want to just perform it yourself, depending on the size of the contract, the complexity. There may be may have been getting some small sole source contracts, and those you could perform on your own. But as you kind of have developed in the 8A program, you may get to, you're at a place where you can perform the work as a company on its own, and then there's no real advantage to having a subcontractor in there, because getting the subcontract in place may require some legal expense, or at least your contracting team to work on the subcontract with the subcontractor, and that's going to take resources and time and additional costs, and maybe from outside parties like an attorney. In some cases, you're going to get better rating on a solicitation evaluation if the prime contractor has the past performance. So the subcontractor past performance is not going to be weighted as heavily, and so it may not be the right approach to use a subcontractor in that situation. you're going to sort of working with a subcontractor, they're going to get better. They could become a competitor to your company. You're kind of sharing those client relationships, those marketing skills, those business development ideas. Of course, that subcontractor is helping their past performance. And I mean, of course, if you're working with a subcontractor, the prime, by definition, is not allowed to control the subcontractor employees. I mean, that's one of the main tenets of having a subcontractor is you kind of leave the particulars of the subcontracted task to the subcontractor, and you can have a little bit of say so on employees and some things like that, but you don't control the employees. You can't tell the subcontractor employees what to do. At that point, you're not really subcontracting part of that work. So if you want all the control, you can handle all of the contract. In some cases, it's a better idea not to subcontract, and it's good to recognize that. Okay, so as far as what are the kind of baseline requirements, the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation, encourages the use of teaming arrangements. So it's not going to normally say don't use teaming arrangements. There's not a lot of details in the FAR on what you have to do in a teaming arrangement, but there are in other parts in the Small Business Administration rules quite a few limitations. In some cases, you're going to want to look at this solicitation itself to see what it encourages. You may want to consult your business opportunity specialist. There's some language in the participation agreement for 8A companies that, it suggests you may want to consult with your business opportunity specialist. But subcontracting plans are not required for small businesses. So that is one thing you can kind of cross off your list, so to speak. So then one of the rules that is found in these Small Business Administration rules is limitation on subcontracting. So the percentages are up there. The basic idea is, as a prime contractor on an 8A contract or any small business contract, the prime contractor has a limit on what it can subcontract to companies that are not similarly situated. So if you have an 8A set aside that's for services, you cannot pay more than 50% of that contract dollar amount to firms that are not also 8A companies. And then there's different percentages for different types of contracts. Your construction versus, the big distinction there is if you're in construction, you have a much higher percentage that you can subcontract to subcontractors versus services contracts. You are much more limited to only paying 50% to subcontractors. So you got to do at least half of the amount of money that the government pays to you has to come to that prime contractor. For non-services contracts, the cost of materials are excluded. So of course, this is just a real basic overview. In some courses, we go over limitation on subcontracting for over an hour. So there's some nuances there for sure, but be aware of that, those limitations as you're going through the various requirements for a small business or 8A set-aside contract, and be aware of those. And then there is kind of an additional component to the limitations on subcontracting that I'll briefly mention. Non-manufacturer rule, if you've seen that term being thrown around, if you're in the supply world or manufacturing world, if you're in doing those sorts of contracts, basically non-manufacturer rule says if you are supplying a good or product, a supply contract to the federal government for a small business or 8A set aside, you have to supply the product of a small business manufacturer that's making the product in the United States. That's the gist of the non-manufacturer rule. It's sort of an alternative version of the limitation on subcontracting for supply contracts. So again, it doesn't apply in services contracts, doesn't apply in construction contracts, only applies in supply contracts where you're not manufacturing those products. So you got to be aware of these limitations when you're performing these contracts. If you're bringing in large businesses, of course, it's even more important to know what these limitations are that the SBA has set out in limitation on subcontracting. In addition, and this is somewhat rare, but if there is a mixed contract, meaning it has a portion that is of the contract is under one type of NAICS code, such as a services-based NAICS code, and it also has a separate component of the contract that is a supply portion, that 50% percentage that we saw in the prior slide for the services part is only going to apply to the services portion of the contract. So basically, this would be if you see this set up in a solicitation or in a contract, you'll know that you have a different sort of calculation to do to ensure you're compliant with the limitation on subcontracting. And then one other little note, you have to include a NAICS code in your subcontracts with that size standard in there. That is a requirement. Rather, a lot of people just flow down the NAICS code from the prime contract, which is okay, but you should be kind of deliberate about it. There could be some particular teaming arrangements where one subcontractor is only doing a part of the work. And in those cases, it may be better to have them have a different NAICS code, depending on what type of work the subcontractor will be doing. I'll turn it back over to Jason.
All right. Thank you, Shane. Thanks for getting us all on the same page there on a lot of the basic terminology and regulations. So I'm going to next get into the processes and benefits of strategic teaming. Before I do that, just a little bit more about me as I switch here from moderator to panelists, just so you know who you're talking to here. So again, I'm Jason Wetzel. I'm the Chief Operating Officer with Gabriel Enterprises. We specialize in virtual learning and virtual event technologies. Personally, I've spent my entire career in some form of federal contracting. Initially, that was as a contracting officer and then as a government program manager, and served in various advisory roles, and then also worked as a consultant and business developer in both large and small business. And I absolutely love sharing what I've learned over the years working in this industry. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing that here as we talk about teaming strategies. So I'm going to just cover these two types of teaming at a high level, and then we'll have a really short live poll where we ask you what you want to cover next, and or what you would like to cover next. And one of the options will be we spend a little more time on this, or we go into two other topics. So the first type of teaming we'll look at here on the left, tactical teaming. So this is less ideal. This is kind of just in time subcontracting without a strategy. And with tactical teaming, I'd say you're waiting until the RFP comes out, or maybe even until you get the contract awarded. And then at that time, you're trying to find teaming partners to address gaps that you have in meeting the RFP evaluation criteria, or if it's the contract, gaps in actually delivering on the requirements of the contract. Then the second type of the teaming that we have here on the right side, strategic teaming. So this is subcontracting with a strategy. And in this case, you have relationships, shared goals, shared understanding of strengths and weaknesses for a portfolio of companies. So ideally here, I think you're pairing up, maybe you have one or two partners that you like to work with for a given client and one or two for a specific technical area. You have kind of some loose work share arrangements, or you have NDAs and non-competes in place just to really keep things moving on your teaming. And then you're pursuing work together for a specific niche, be it a client or a technical area, with each one of those companies in the portfolio, and you're able to complement one another in those areas. And whenever I say you're pursuing work or pursuing opportunities, you may hear that and think, okay, we're going after RFPs together. That sounds pretty normal. Actually, no, that's not what I'm talking about. When I say pursuing work together or pursuing opportunities, I'm talking about sharing relationships, sharing opportunities, sharing market intelligence, even before those RFPs hit the street, especially before they hit the street. That's when it's most useful to share that market intelligence. So you're finding the specific opportunity before the government posts it on a public site like sam.gov or GSA eBuy. And this is where teaming with a large business can be incredibly helpful. A lot of times, large businesses have their hands in many different agencies and associations, and they can really connect the dots, especially with some of those larger, higher dollar initiatives that involve many agencies. So it can be helpful to team with large businesses. Also, on the other hand, I think it can be helpful to team with small businesses. Shane mentioned very briefly, it was buried in the limitations on subcontracting bullets, the similarly situated entity rule, which basically says, if something is set aside, let's say for a woman-owned small business, and two women-owned small businesses are going after that, that 50% rule on the limitations on subcontracting is essentially irrelevant. It doesn't matter because it's set aside for woman-owned small business. Either business can be kind of have the lion's share of the work share. And I think the interesting dynamic that that creates is if you have two similarly situated entities, even if they're just two small businesses going after work, it sort of removes that hierarchy that you have when you might have kind of a traditional, large business, small business relationship, or maybe an 8A and a non-8A small business. It removes that hierarchy and really allows you to, I think, share information freely and really go after opportunities and offer a customer what is the truly the best fit for that work in terms of the two companies. All right, so like I said, I'm going to launch a choose your own adventure poll here to allow you to pick the next topic if you happen to be familiar with the choose your own adventure kids books. This is kind of like the democracy version of that. So the choice is yours. Where we go next, we'll pick the choice with the most votes. I'll give it just a moment here for you to pick which way you want to go. If you pick A, we'll spend a little more time talking about the areas that we just talked about. We'll dive into a couple scenarios. If you pick B, we'll talk about how you can basically start with a large list of teaming partners and whittle that down to a manageable number that you can work with. And then if you pick C, we'll talk about subcontracting from the gig economy. I can start to see where this might be headed here. So I'm going to start looking at that. I'll give it just another moment here before we share the results with you and move on to the next topic. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. It looks like the winner is like to learn more about how to find teaming partners. Excellent. Let me just zip forward to that slide here. And if you do have any questions about what I just covered, feel free to chime in with those questions. All right, so how do we start with a large data set of teaming partners and work our way down? Well, first, if you happen to have an existing client, existing relationships, I would absolutely start there before going into the big list. But let's say you don't have many existing clients or much of an existing network. How do you find good subcontractors among such a large group, thousands of government contractors? Well, we recommend taking kind of a funnel approach to this process. And this slide is also in the resource center if you want to refer back to it. But basically, you're starting with what's called the dynamic small business search, which has all small businesses. Or if you're looking for large businesses, you can use sam.gov. And there's a section in sam.gov where you can search for companies. You're going to use either one of those tools to generate your initial list. And DSBS is a very helpful tool. It's a little complicated to work with. So we have a video in the resource center where we show you how to work with that tool. It's a little bit feels like .com era technology. No offense to SBA. I'm really hoping that they update it soon, but it's an incredibly powerful tool. I will say that. And one of the things I like about it is it gives you a summary paragraph on the capabilities for each firm. I don't think you get that with sam.gov. So that can be really helpful in your keyword searches, when you export it into Excel or something like that. But so you can also in each one of these tools, you can filter by certain things like NAICS codes or location, other criteria. So you want to put some criteria in so you're not getting a massive list, just to start narrowing it down. And then you're going to export one or both of those lists. And what you're going to get for each company right now is a DUNS number. Eventually, that will be a unique entity identifier. It'll work roughly the same way. And you're going to plug that number, that unique identifier, the DUNS number, into USA spending. So we're working our way down to the next part of the funnel here. And in USA spending, then for each one of those contractors, you can get a list of their previous and current contracts. So any contract that they've been awarded, even if it was awarded on a contract vehicle or GSA schedule where you didn't see the RFP, you're going to get those contracts. And from this, you're going to really, I think, start to connect the dots. You're going to get a sense of what contracts they have, if they're at an agency you're targeting. And there's going to be a paragraph in this case on what the contract is, and not always helpful. Sometimes we'll just say this is modification for or something to that effect. But you should get some information from the description field of the contract. And then from there, you start working your way down to the next section. And you want to document all of this as you're going, because ultimately you're working towards having a list of 10 to 20 companies that you might actually be able to work with. Once you get a sense for those contracts, then you're going into company websites, LinkedIn articles. You will be absolutely shocked at how much you can start to piece together if you just apply a little bit of human intelligence to all the data that's out there. And then once you have a good feel, I think for maybe I'd say 10 to 20 might be too many. Maybe 10 to 15 companies that you think you might be able to work with. And then at that point, then you can start reaching out to people with a specific value proposition, emphasis on specific, right? You don't want to just send a BCC to 15 contractors and say, hey, here's who we are, here's our capability statement. What I'd really suggest doing is taking the time to look at, what were those specific contracts, what dots were you able to connect, and how can you then fit into that puzzle as an additional contractor, or maybe you have some insight on a particular opportunity that you can share, that you can start to build some trust with, and start to work with some companies. But then, you're kind of exploring values alignment and seeing if this is the type of company that you want to work with. So again, hopefully that's helpful in getting a sense for how you can start with a large group of companies, even thousands, and whittle it down to just a small group that you can talk to and reach out to, and then hopefully work with. All right, and since we didn't pick that topic, I'm going to zip past that. And it looks like we don't have any outstanding questions at the moment. Again, feel free to chime in with questions at any time. But otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Shane to take us through this next topic.
Yes, thank you. So the earlier parts of this, we talked about, when do you choose to subcontract? Now we're going to talk about, you've made that decision that it's good for the particular solicitation that you want to go after. And then how do you actually set yourself up for success, or at least kind of know what risks are out there, how to manage those risks. That's what I always think of myself as an attorney, and what I'm doing is helping business people manage these risks through agreements, or just the knowledge of what the potential risks are. And one of those is, of course, what you're putting in your teaming agreement that you're going to enter into with your proposed subcontractor. And of course, if you're on one side of the table versus the other side of the table, you're going to have different things you're trying to get out of this. You're going to have sort of different goals and objectives. And it's the negotiating between the business people on each side of that table that is where you decide these things. But you got to know what are the key categories, what are the key terms and provisions that you have to decide about, that you have to negotiate on. And of course, maybe, my job as an attorney is then to advise people on that, and then to implement that into language when necessary. But, a lot of this is derived from business negotiation on these various topics. Now, there's a lot on this slide. So, I won't go through every one of these, but these are the types of things some of these you're already aware of, or maybe you give them different labels. As the prime contractor, and some of this boils down to, who's in control, and the concreteness and the definition, or how closely detailed the terms are and how much flexibility there are. Those are kind of some of the key components that the parties are negotiating as part of the teaming agreement, and coming up with what their language is going to be in their teaming agreement. So the prime contractor on the left side there is going to want is going to want help on the proposal process, for instance. So your teaming agreement has to go into those details on what the subcontractor is going to contribute for actually drafting the proposal. Who drafts what section for a particular solicitation. How does that review process work? You can put those details and should put some level of detail into your teaming agreement for how that process is going to work. Of course, the prime contractor is ultimately the one that has to answer to the government. So they're going to want to control the contract. That has to be set out in the teaming agreement. Don't just think that's kind of implied. You should at least mention it briefly that, who's the prime contractor. They're in charge of the contract. They're in charge of communicating with the federal government. And some of these things, though, are a little bit more nuanced, such as exclusivity. As the prime contractor, you may want to try and lock in through these teaming agreements that the subcontractors are only going to work with your company for a particular proposal, for a particular agency and solicitation. Whereas as the prime, you want to have some flexibility and maximize your flexibility to potentially have a team of potential subcontractors, and maybe, for instance, maybe it's a multiple award contract. So certain task orders, you're going to want to have certain members of your team do more work. So you want to maintain that kind of flexibility versus if it's kind of a single award, one particular contract, you still may want to have that flexibility with your team. Whereas your subcontractor is going to want to sort of decrease the flexibility, so to speak, in the sense of they want the prime to say, hey, as subcontractor, we commit to you getting a specific work share. Now, the way that you define that work share is, of course, up to the parties. You can use, percentages, maybe dollar amount goals, or areas of work could be another way, such as categories, labor categories, FTE. Of course, you're going to want to be careful as the prime that you're not overly committing to a certain amount, but you may want to give some concreteness to the proposed subcontractor, so they're not operating just on, hey, we'll figure it out later. Maybe you want to provide some goals or percentages. If you can't get if you don't know the details of a particular contract at the time you're submitting a proposal, because it's going to be under task orders, for instance, you at least give them some detail. You're not required to commit to certain subcontractors, and the teaming agreement from the prime contractor's perspective may want to say that, hey, we're going to, and parties certainly do this, we're going to figure out work share later. We don't know what it is at this point for this contract. At this point, we're going to set forth the process by which we will determine or allocate work share at a later time. So it definitely depends on what solicitation you're going after, how you approach those various components. Employees of the subcontractor, another one. Do you put in what are the processes going to be for doing that? The prime contractor is of course, going to control funding and payment of invoices and that sort of thing. So prime contractor are looking for control, looking for kind of maximum flexibility, but does want the subcontractor or proposed subcontractor to be involved in that proposal process. Subcontractor, on the other hand, may be also looking to maximize their flexibility, but also want some concreteness in what the prime is offering them if the team does indeed win the contract. So there's some tension there that has to be negotiated between the parties. Maybe I always think, you look through a teaming agreement, and maybe there's a handful of items that are really require negotiation. There's really some trade-offs that have to be made, and maybe on the other stuff people can, agree, and you kind of stick to your guns or have your certain items that are most important to you, and those are the ones you really work for on behalf of your side of the negotiating table. And maybe you negotiate or allow the other party to have a little bit more say on some of the other items. So definitely it's a negotiating process, and you have to know what's most important to your company. But these type of items on this slide and some of the other slides are the things you have to be concerned about in your teaming agreement, of course. And you may have your other items that have become important to you as you've subcontracted with companies over the years, and you want to have those in there too, because it's tailored to your particular company. So here's some of those, the last slide was all the things you have to negotiate in terms of the overall goals. Here's some particular details you want to have in your teaming agreement. Always make sure those are in there when you're working on a teaming agreement. Price, if it's a firm fixed price, or maybe cost reimbursable, you have other details in there. What about option years? Do you have to, give the option? Is it at the discretion of the prime contractor? The prime contractor may want to say, okay, maybe we switch to a different subcontractor for certain option years. Exclusivity is a big one. I touched on it on the prior slide. Flexibility versus exclusivity. If you're bidding on multiple pools of a multiple award contract, you got to sort of think through the exclusivity that you want to have in there. And you got to think about, for these teaming agreements, I think of it almost on the one hand, it's sort of a litmus test over how you negotiate with that proposed subcontractor. Yes, it may be enforceable later in time, although that's a whole different topic depending on state law. So we really can't get into that, but you also think of it as, this is a negotiating tool. This is where we're setting forth what we agree to. This is how we're seeing how the two parties work together. And setting and agreeing to those things is very helpful to determine maybe where there will be stress points later on during contract performance. Of course, you're going to want to include things like a non-disclosure, either through in some cases you may have a separate non-disclosure agreement, and then you refer to that in your teaming agreement, and that's plenty of companies do it that way. Or you can have specific agreement to not disclose the business information of each party. You can have certain subcontract terms. Again, you may not, a lot of companies don't do an entire subcontract template, but they may have some of those terms to include. Maybe your company is very concerned about invoicing, or the subcontractor is, and how that's going to work, or how you're going to figure out work share, or what if the government changes the total work share? How do the parties work that out in their subcontract? So some of those terms you may want to include in your teaming agreement. Other companies may have worked together, maybe more familiar with each other, and they have an understanding. We're going to work those subcontract terms out later as part of the subcontract negotiation. So it does depend on how your working relationship is with your teaming partner. There on the right there, you see kind of a sequence of events for coming up with the teaming agreement and the whole process, finding your partner, some of the things that Jason was mentioning. What are the general terms, those negotiating the big picture items? You're coming up with your teaming agreement, you're having that in place, then you're submitting your proposal once that's in place. And you definitely do want to have your teaming agreement in place prior to submitting the proposal. Otherwise, it sort of doesn't have as much of a purpose, because you're talking about how you're going to agree to work on different aspects of the proposal. So that one's pretty much how it's normally done. Sometimes people, this is an ideal schedule, and sometimes people do it a little differently, but ideally you want to have that teaming agreement in place before you submit your proposal, of course, so you can have those terms defined for both parties. Then you receive the prime contract award, and then you sign the subcontract. Of course, you can be negotiating the subcontract during that whole process so that you're ready. If you have a good chance at award, you're ready to sign that right away and not have a delay. And so it's sort of a continual process of having these terms, putting some of those terms in the big picture world, then putting them in the teaming agreement, then putting those into your subcontract, and sort of carrying them through. Okay, and I talked about, as an attorney, the job is to minimize risk. So here's some of those specific items you want to be concerned about. Your own contracting person in your company, or maybe you have a contracting office, is of course going to be aware of these things, but it's good to make sure they're kind of staying up to date on them, keeping track of all of these potential areas where there can be problems. So non-disclosure agreements, I think for most companies, they're going to have those before they start discussing the details on a particular proposal. Some companies do it later, but it is fairly common to have those in place before you start any discussions. And then your NDA can then apply or be referenced in your teaming agreement or attached to it. The non-disclosure agreement is going to be both parties' agreement that they're not going to disclose the proprietary information of the other party. You want to make sure you're looking at those specifically for your company, and that it makes sense, in your industry and in the federal contracting world, not necessarily taking one off the internet. For instance, the FAR has a specific whistleblower provision that says an NDA must include an exception for fraud against the government, that you must have basically a way for a whistleblower to talk to the government, and you can't restrict that in your NDA. So that's a very common one that is sometimes missing from an NDA that's going to be used in a federal contracting world. You want to make these, in most cases, you want to kind of make them bilateral to they protect both parties, not just one party. And then if you do have a specific requirement, such as a protective legend, make sure you're following through with those as you share information. Particular case, someone said that there'd be a protective legend, and the parties didn't put it on one of the documents, and it became not proprietary at that point, or not confidential. So you got to make sure you're actually working with the provisions in your NDA that you agreed to. Okay, flow down clauses. These are provisions from the prime contract that the subcontractor is going to be responsible for or held to account for the same way as a prime contractor. A lot of them, as you see the example there, the prime contractor has to include the substance of this clause, particular FAR clauses in a subcontract. Now, they're not required to necessarily be in the teaming agreement. They're required in the subcontract. So that's where you'd normally put these sorts of references. In a lot of cases, what we do is you can either reference the prime contract and say that all these flow down clauses are going to be incorporated by reference. You can actually attach portions of the prime contract, or you can reference the specific FAR clauses that are being flowed down. A lot of times it seems like people are fine with attaching the relevant portions of the prime contract. Does make the overall document much, can make it much larger, but it's sometimes easier than actually going through and making a separate list of all the flow down contracts. Now you see with very large prime contractors, they're often going to have a separate list of all these FAR clauses and agency specific clauses that are flowed down, and will include that in a subcontract. So you can do it different ways, but you have to have these clauses referenced. Here's some example language that lets you incorporate clauses from the prime contract by reference. So you'd have this sort of phrasing in there, and then you'd put in the list of clauses, or as I said, in some cases you may attach the particular portions of the prime contract to reference those items. So you can sort of do it, different ways. In addition, there's kind of prime contract clauses that aren't FAR clauses. Those should also be, in some cases, flowed down. Inspection by the government, modifications, costs, disputes. Now, some of these are going to want to vary. They're not really necessarily in the prime contract, but you want to have the required components that are in the prime contract incorporated into your subcontract, but you may have a different dispute clause. One thing in particular I'll point out on this slide, subcontractor agreement to cooperate with the prime contractor as to claims and suits. Basically, if there's a dispute between the government and the prime contractor, you want the subcontractor to agree to provide information and be involved in those sorts of claims against the government. So that's a key one. But these are various clauses you're going to want to, of course, have in your subcontract. They may include things from the prime contract, or they may be varied if the parties agree to something slightly different, but you never want to be in a situation where your subcontractors not doing something that the government requires. So kind of the prime contract is the floor for subcontractor performance and requirements and things like that. Okay, so kind of getting back to the big picture on how these are going to work. The prime has the ultimate responsibility for performance in the government's eyes. If a subcontractor goes out of business or just doesn't do the work, doesn't get there on time, it's the prime contractor that has that responsibility to find someone else to do the work or do the self-perform the work in some cases. But the government's going to look to the prime contractor for meeting the requirements of the contract, which is why with subcontractors, you have to be very careful with the amount of work you're delegating to them and knowing that subcontractor as much as possible before choosing them to be on a team. Okay, and of course, you want to kind of present a unified front to the government. The government doesn't want to get involved in disputes between the prime and sub. They rarely will even listen to those or provide any feedback on that sort of thing. So the prime has to make it very clear to the subcontractor, this is what you have to do. Those terms have to be in your teaming agreement and subcontract. And you want to make sure your communications from a subcontractor employee are vetted or at least kind of reviewed by the prime contractor before they're sending stuff to the government, so that you have kind of that unified approach, unified types of communications, unified front to presenting that to the government. Okay, so then you've got a little bit of an exit strategy as you're getting towards the end of your 8A term. How can some of these concepts be useful in that regard? So subcontracting can really help your business. You can deepen your experience and expertise. So that's a kind of useful way to get into different areas of performance. You kind of learn new industries maybe, or learn how to work with different agencies. You can potentially, as you're graduating from the 8A program, maybe you find a small business that you've subcontracted to that's then getting into the 8A program. That's a pretty common scenario. And then maybe be a mentor to that company as a protege. And mentor-protege arrangements even allow for equity ownership of a portion of the protege. So this subcontracting can really be a way to expand your business and help you exit the 8A program. And then I'll leave you with a few do's and don'ts here for the road. We mentioned a lot of these, but I will start at the end here. Don't use a one-size-fits-all teaming agreement or subcontract. Make sure you tailor that to the specific parties and the specific solicitation. And you want to make sure you're having, written teaming agreement. And then you can really expand your foothold in your team of parties that you work with. So it's a great way to really expand your business development. I'll turn it back over to Jason.
Right, thank you, Shane. So it looks like we don't have any outstanding questions, so we will move to close. Thank you all for this hour you spent with us today. Really appreciate you taking time out to join us. Really hope this was helpful as you think about how to execute those contracts with teaming partners, and also before that, how to find teaming partners. Today's session was recorded and it will be available on the completed tab in the main theater within just a few hours. After we close out, you'll be redirected to a post-course survey. We ask you to take that survey, let us know what you thought of today's session. I personally review all the feedback that comes in. A lot of it is really helpful, so keep that coming. I also just posted the survey link in the chat here, just so you don't miss that landing page after the session. After you take a couple minutes to complete that survey, please browse around the virtual environment. Definitely check out the Resource Center. I mentioned it a couple times today. A lot of helpful content in there. Your certificate for today's attendance will be available in your virtual learning environment profile within just a few hours. If you don't see that, or if you have any other questions, you can email us at support@geconsultinggroup.com. sba.com, and that email address will also be located in the help desk booth during off hours. Thank you and enjoy the remainder of your day.